Hello, Doctrine of Revelation. My name is Alex Renner. Today I'm going to be presenting on the chapter from the 5 Views on Biblical Inerrancy book. I'm going to be presenting on the 5th and final chapter by John R. Franke. John R. Franke is a theologian, more of a postmodern theologian, not necessarily outside of the evangelical sphere, but definitely more on what would traditionally be considered post-conservative or progressive, though not liberal progressive, more of like evangelical progressive, if that's even possible. So the chapter is called Recasting Inerrancy, the Bible as Witness to Missional Plurality. I chose to do this chapter because I thought it was one of the most interesting ones. It made me think the most. I would say this one, Van Hooser's chapter, and Enns' chapter really turned my cogs, and especially Peter Enns, I really enjoyed his one, in the sense that it really challenged me, and it pushed against a lot of my presuppositions and in what I think about what it means for the Bible to be inerrant. And obviously he takes it, in my opinion, he takes it a bit far. But Frank, I think he goes in Enns' direction, but still maintains the language and the orthodoxy that I think should mark an evangelical. The sort of skepticism that Enns displays is a little too radical, in my opinion. But I'm not here talking about Enns. I'm supposed to be talking about Franke. So let me begin. John R. Franke, he's a linguistically minded theologian, and he starts his chapter by defining how he affirms inerrancy. And then he points out what he considers the philosophical flaw in the foundation of the Chicago Statement. And he says that is what's called foundationalism. Foundationalism, to him, is the particularly modern outlook, which has been pretty discredited in many circles today. That's by his own admission. And if you have any if you have any knowledge of philosophical history, then you know that we're definitely in the postmodern era right now, or maybe even the postmodern era, which is a reaction against this modern philosophical outlook marked by things like foundationalism. And foundationalism and the Enlightenment, the modern project, is all about finding certain knowledge. It's about propositional assertions and axioms, finding the certain foundation for all knowledge. And somebody like Albert Mohler, with definitely a more modern stance to his theological quest, if you will, he does see the Bible as, in a foundationalist way, as the locus of certain knowledge across all fields that cannot be contradicted, or the whole thing falls apart. If the Bible is wrong in one area, then according to the foundationalist like Mohler, it all crumbles. It's not inerrant anymore because there's a flaw, because there's an error in this particular way, in this particular definition of an error, right? Because these foundationalist this foundationalist baggage is put onto the Bible as what inerrancy means is it must mean this. It must mean that it has to be completely right about all things that it seems to clearly assert. And so, in that way, Foundationalism marks the Chicago Statement, according to Franke. And foundationalism conflicts with his own philosophy of truth. So Franke is different in that he confesses a plural theory of truth. And he claims that it would do justice to some of the seeming like theological variety in the Bible and also in the church. Like, maybe not theological, but like the Bible is marked by plurality. It's a bunch of different sort of texts from a bunch of different sort of people that are giving different outlooks and perspectives on the same one truth, right? That's why we have 4 Gospels, he says, is because each person brings a different perspective fitting into this pluralist model of truth that isn't just one universal, systematic, modern system of knowledge. It's this, of objective knowledge. It's rather this subjective experience, subjective interaction with this objective truth that is true, but which requires all of the subjective voices in order to truly perceive this objective truth that is objective. And he would say that sort of model gives correct respect. It gives due diligence to the phenomena of Scripture, to the weirdness and the variety and the perspectival nature of Scripture, and that we need that, and we can't think that the Bible is just one book. I mean, obviously we know it's one book, but it's a collection of writings, and it's not like we put it in one book because it's a collection. And actually the word Bible comes from biblios, I think biblios, which means the book. Anyways, then Franke moves on to talk about, so another part of his argument is, so he talks about this plural version of truth, or this plural model of truth, but then he also talks about the Scriptures and how they are both divine and human, and he kind of splits this along the lines of the hypostatic union. So if you're familiar with the hypostatic union, it's the doctrine that Jesus Christ is both God and man, and the man side of Jesus' nature is 100% man. He totally enters into our experience. He totally knows what it's like to be human, just like we know what it's like to be human, which is why we're saved, which is why we can know him and love him, and he can understand our situation and can actually communicate to us, is because he knows exactly what it's like to be human, and he can use language just as we use language to communicate. But that's not it. And that's not all. But then on the divine side, he is 100% divine, so he's totally God. He is the Son in the Trinity. He is the Son of God. So completely human, completely God. And Franke says we should look at the Bible this way. The Bible is a divine set of scriptures, in that it all points to this objective big T truth. So he splits it up. There's this objective big T truth. He says it's the capital T truth. And then there's the small t truth, so the lowercase t truth over here, on the human side. So on the divine side, there's the ultimate reality of who God is, and the ultimate experience of God's self, which is the term he uses. And he essentially says, like, in order to know God as God is in God's self, which is like a direct quote, you kind of have to be God. Like, there's definitely a veil of mystery. We can use right language to speak about God, but it's never fully capturing in a univocal way the totality, the reality of who God is. And then on this human side over here, the small t truth, it is bound by time and space and human language and culture and context. So this is what he says we have in the Bible. So in the Bible, we have this set of documents that is exactly what I said, bound by time, space, Hebraic culture, language primarily, and the language that we have of God over here in the Bible is, it speaks rightly about this big T over here. It speaks rightly about the divine side. It speaks rightly about the capital T truth over here, but it's still small t truth. It's not the big T truth. It cannot capture the totality of who God is over here. And he says that if we recognize that, like, it's bound by these geographical, cultural factors, it can do justice to maybe some of the discrepancies, which isn't necessarily like a lot of the three examples that each contributor is required to address. He says a lot of them are not consequential to the big T truth over here, and honestly, a lot of these examples that what he says is a lot of these examples that are given to them are only seen as discrepancies systematization. You know what I'm trying to say? This view that the Bible needs to fit into this one universal sort of coherent system instead of this plural sort of perspectival outlook that does due diligence to the phenomena of Scripture. Because when we realize that just like us, just like all humanity, this book is bound by time and space and is limited in its scope and it's limited in its descriptive nature, it makes us just go like, whew, because we don't have to apply to it these lofty standards that modernity has tried to place on it, and that a lot of evangelicals have tried to place on it. And so the definition of an inerrancy that he holds to is not necessarily this, or it's not at all this modern view where it has to get every single thing right, or, it all cracks, the foundation is cracked and none of it can be trusted. Because I think he even asks near the end, he's like, to say that some minor historical detail could be off when it may or may not, when that book may or may not have even been claiming to be purely historical, to say that should make us doubt like the resurrection of Jesus Christ, like the central doctrine of our faith, or even like the doctrine of the Trinity, to say that and like this and this have equal weight with each other, that if this is wrong, then this must be wrong too, that we can't trust any of it. Like he says, that's a big leap, and that is a product of us putting these lofty standards that the Bible does not even call for us to put on, and that we're looking at the Bible with these truly limited Western eyes, or maybe not limited, but almost like we're trying to be God. We're trying to escape the determinedness, the contextual nature of being human, and we're trying to be God, in the way we look at texts and the way we look at the Bible in particular. I have a few quotes before I stop, because that pretty much sums up his stance on things. He's very linguistic in that, and in one of his replies, I think it might have been to Enns, I forgot who it was, but he talks about language games. So he talks about so there's this philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein who came up with this idea of language games as this community-oriented idea about how the language we use is so culturally conditioned by an innumerable set of factors about like where we're from, what our society considers important, there's so many things, but like how even the words we speak are a tool for us to communicate and get what we want within our communities, but not necessarily only get what we want, but it's this unifying factor and this communicative medium within these different communities. This is why we have all these different languages. And he's very focused on that, and he sees and I think he's very he's very up to date philosophically, because if you know anything about the history of philosophy right now, the hot button thing is language. Everybody's into language now. Language is the new sexy thing. It's the new philosophy focus. So I would encourage you to read more of his stuff. I'm probably going to pick up one of his books after this because I just find him so fascinating, and I myself find language to be so fascinating. But that's besides the point. I'll end here with a few quotes, and then we'll stop. So he says, human language is incapable. This is talking about the difference between capital T truth and small t truth. Saying human language is incapable of providing descriptions of God that are fully faithful to the reality of God as God is in God's self. This means that while God's use of language in the act of self-revelation allows us to speak in authentically informative ways about God, we must still acknowledge the inherent mystery and otherness of God, even in the act of bearing witness to God through our speech. And then here's another quote. Scripture is truth written, small t, and that it provides a series of faithful witnesses to the capital T truth of God's self-revelation without becoming a manifestation of capital T truth. So, interesting chapter, wonderful writer, wonderful theologian, great book, to be honest. I love this. I'm going to keep this on my shelf forever. So, have a great day, guys. God bless. Yeah.